have an interim meeting somewhere in Scotland, so that we can go.
Do you need?
No, I'm powered up. I might. I'll monitor the chat.
You want me to do the intro slides when we get to substance? You can take over.
Oh yeah, we'll go back and forth. We have our nice little slide machine here.
Lovely, 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 lovely. Yeah, Adam chased me out, and it got me out of being in a discussion. So you know, I'll join the room anyway because why not? I get that right?
It's 2:30. We're ready to start.
Are folks settled in, ready to roll? Excellent. Almost. We'll wait till our minute taker starts minuting. Where did I put the Etherpad page?
I've got it up.
Ah, well done. All right. Note well. Since it's a Monday, I will actually note the note well. So there are a bunch of BCPs floating around in this organization that tell you what participation requirements are. Some of them include things regarding intellectual property. If you are someone who is worried about that, you better go read them before you sit here and look all cute. And there's other things about other behaviors that you should engage in and not engage in. Please read up on these things if you have not already. They are listed here. So, Administrivia, Matt's going to be taking minutes. Peter and I are both going to be in the Jabber room, but if someone else wants to keep an eye on things, that would be helpful. Ted, thank you. Blue sheets are going around? Yes, good. And we have an agenda to bash. So let's bash. So beyond Administrivia, and this BOF, we're going to do pretty much chair-driven and then discussion in each point, simply because I think it's going to be a lot of explaining what the problem and goals here are, and the mic lines will be open as we get to each topic. There's not a long discussion of each thing. In any event, we'll do goals and non-goals for the BOF up front, review what our current state of affairs is, look at the problems with the current state of affairs, look at some straw man proposals that were put together, 2 of them to be precise, and then figure out some next steps. Anybody have complaints about this structure or things to add or subtract or multiply? I love happiness and silence. Always a good thing. Will do. Yeah, we've got very good sound in this place, but yes, it's robust. I'm usually robust myself. But. All right, so we have several goals for the session today. We want to figure out the problem space of internationalization reviews and what we need to do with them. We want to come to some high-level agreement on solutions to the problems that we're having doing these reviews nowadays. We've got 2 proposals that are on the list, and we will describe those 2. They either come down to basically an internationalization review team or writing an internationalization considerations RFC. And yes, and that is a non-exclusive or. It's a proper or. So both of those things might occur. The group might decide that both of those things are worth doing. Specific non-goal is to figure out how to handle the larger internationalization initiatives and things. So if you thought you were here about that, please do not be too disappointed. So, Peter, you want to talk about specifics?
Sure, Pete. Thank you so much. Pete and I were co-ADs together, so we used to call it the Pete and Repeat. So this is Pete and Repeat. So issues come up, and there's a number of things that over the years we have defined that have impinged upon internationalization. Character sets, if you go and look at the background materials are RC 2277. So some of these things have been around for quite some time. A UTF-8, there are other also encoding. So for instance, URIs, sometimes we try to encode Unicode, full Unicode characters outside the ASCII range into URIs. Internationalized domain names, we have had 2 versions go rounds on that, IDNA and IDNA 2008. We have some non-DNS protocol identifiers. So we had the Précis work that was done to address a lot of that. And there's a lot of security implications, which I forgot to put the RFC in there, but it was an IAB document about authorization and authentication with regard to internationalized strings. And so very interesting things can happen there when we're doing string comparison and want to know if something is allowed to have access to something. So these are some, and Alexi and I actually had, when we had to review the art reviewers going at one point, we had a whole wiki page about this. We should track that down again. And there's others as well, which we could add to, I'm sure. Is there I should be doing something else. Okay. Yeah. So we have a number of different kinds of documents that come through that need looking at. We have internet drafts, which are not directly about internationalization, but have things in them that need to be looked at. So they might have some text strings, even things like error messages that can be sent around. How do we want to handle those? So they might need to be flagged as, even if it's UTF-8, well, does it need a language tag, things like that. So we will, as things come through, we'll look at those. There's some, I would say, kind of relatively straightforward applications of some of our existing technology. So we have things like the LAMPS work that happened recently, I'll refer to a couple times, where we wanted to be able to support IDNs in PKI certificates. How does that get done? Folks get pulled in and we look at those. Then there's some thornier issues that John mentioned on the list, which we've had less success of late in getting reviews on. This impinges a little bit, I think, or touches on what Pete was mentioning with some of the larger efforts, but some of these are a little bit more straightforward than others, and then some are more difficult. But these are the sorts of documents that come through that we need to take a look at. And then, so how do we have folks look at these things? Well, sometimes people reach out early on because they realize there's some areas that they don't know as much about, and so they might need some help. And that's my understanding of what happened with the LAMPS working group. I think people reached out to maybe you and Patrick Falstrom to say, hey, we don't have expertise here, we need some help. That works well sometimes if people have awareness that they need to reach out. Oftentimes things get flagged in during IESG review, sometimes earlier in working group last call or IETF last call. Often area directors, current area directors can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know this is where things often came up in the past. And then whoever gets flagged says, oh, well, we need to find someone who knows about this. So maybe it's John or maybe it's me, sometimes Pete Resnick, Patrick Falstrom, other folks, depending on what topic comes up, we might take a look at things. Worst case, maybe people weren't really recognizing that there was an issue and review doesn't happen at all. Hopefully that's not really what happens, but we don't really have a systematic way to find what we need to review. And who does these? Well, we have some people, they know some things, and people find them and see if they can have that knowledge applied to the things they're working on. This is kind of okay in the sense that, we typically find the right folks sometimes, but it's kind of ad hoc, right? So someone maybe reaches out to John or they reach out to me or someone else. and say, hey, I could use some help on this if they're aware. We don't, so that's kind of how things work now. It's a sort of adhocracy, if you would. And then we sort of informally provide feedback. It's a one-off thing. We don't necessarily capture what gets said. And so we're not really, figuring out, have a stable of advice that we provide. Pete, you want to talk about some problems? I like to talk about the easy stuff.
Yeah. So the not reliably identifying the documents needing review, the worst case scenario is not identifying them at all, but even having it happen during IASG review, I think all of the art area directors for the past few years have gotten very used to finding keywords in all sorts of other internet drafts and going, that's going to be an internationalization thing because you use the word string and probably we need to go look at that. But that's not sustainable and it's very late in the process. We also have a pretty small number of people who we can hand these things off to with at least reasonable chops. None of us, I believe, are saying that we have to have the expert of all experts do this every time, but we need people who at least have read through and understand the issues well enough to be able to identify that there might be an issue there. And the problem there is that we're not training folks as we go along to come up to speed on how to find these issues and what to do about them. Yeah, well, I mean, we've done some. Are there other problems that folks are seeing with this?
Yeah, the other problem is that some of the people whom you have traditionally been calling on, because of this problem, are getting disgusted and are getting less and less responsive, and that creates a feedback loop of the sort one doesn't like.
Yes. Grumpiness in this particular group of people is not desirable in the long run. Yeah, John.
Yeah, John Levine. I've also noticed, and I'm sure I'm as guilty of this as anybody, sort of in a lack of consistency in about what the issues are and what to do about them.
Right. I think that's fair. So, a couple of proposals have been put out. One is to basically form something that we do in lots of other areas as well, which is an internationalization directorate. So not including documents that are specifically about internationalization per se, this would be going through documents on some sort of regular basis to review for common internationalization issues. Also would include, if requested or if discovered, giving guidance to particular working groups on the applications of existing internationalization technology. So the sort of thing that happened with LAMPS. Trying to walk through and help solve some of the thornier internationalization issues that come up. Although, again, that's the kind of stuff that probably requires a dedicated working group to address for a particular internationalization kind of problem space. But for more general things, certainly that directorate can help. And, maybe that for purposes of a working group might be like a design team that works on internationalization stuff in the first place. The other proposal, I'm sorry, we're still on directorate. The idea is much like the Gen Art or sector. It would not review every internet draft that went through, simply just time constraints. As I was talking about with regard to ADs doing it, there's a relatively easy way to triage documents to figure out whether it's worth giving them a more thorough review, to look for particular kinds of data that is floating around in a particular protocol spec. Where necessary, we end up reviewing documents as a team to be able to communicate knowledge to other team members and do some expert reviewing as a team. So, yeah.
Daniel or Pete, you just said, I think I heard you say, that it's relatively easy to triage documents there by criteria. Is that criteria written down somewhere?
I think, this is Peter. I think one of the problems is we don't really have a lot written down. And so depending on an oral tradition, that is not necessarily a sustainable way to do things.
And the other thing going on there is I can tell you that I have I can't describe to you what the possible internationalization problem is, but I know it when I see it. So those of us who've been doing it a while and know the issues can kind of go, that's going to be a problem, but some of it is complicated to describe what exactly you're looking for. If it says string, that's easy. If it says, some data and you notice that it looks like they might be putting text in there, even though it's just a blob of bits, that's harder to notice sometimes.
All right. Well, no, go ahead,
I
Barry.
just said that this is Barry Lee, but Dan is not asking about getting down into it. He's just asking for triage. And at the triage level, yes, looking for strings, looking for UTF-8 somewhere in there. There's a pretty easy way to say, this document probably doesn't have internationalization issues. This document needs a little more look.
But you're right. Not much of it is written down.
All right.
in a
I was just
useful
struck by
way.
that comment because that seems like a way to help with that. All right.
This is Andrew Sullivan. If we could write down reliably how to do that triage, we wouldn't have to have this BOF. And that's actually part of the problem here. That because the sense is the sense develops really from the observation that, gee, there's a payload here where actually somebody's supposed to do something with this payload, and that turns out to mean that there's something in there that somebody has to care about. But there's something in there that somebody has to care about is not really a triage strategy. That's somebody needs to have a look at all the things, and while they're going along, people need to notice, oh, well, there could be an issue here, and then you send it off.
Yeah, the security ones were, I think, the more interesting discovery that those of us who did these reviews noticed, because the security people would sometimes say, no, we're just treating that as a binary string to do whatever manipulations on. But some of us realized, wait a minute, but you're getting that supposed binary string from user input. And that user input is usually going to be through a keyboard with certain features and certain ways of encoding that input that might be different between different keyboards. So it was, now that's an easy one to notice. But yeah, I think Andrew's right. These, as we've learned, we come up with new ways of discovering these.
Yeah, John Clenson here. We may be using triage in slightly different ways or not understanding it the same way where that stops. Identifying a document that needs further attention is pretty easy. And we could probably write down a bunch of heuristics, if not rules, for identifying those documents and get it right almost all the time. The difficulty comes in with what happens next. And that tends to require some specialized expertise and discussion.
Yep. +1, John. I think when we were talking about triage on the list or various discussions, it was that first feature. Okay, how do we route this bug essentially and figure out that there might be a bug here? Yes, addressing the problem is a harder thing.
There's an additional complication there, which is that if you've got a small pool of people who can do the work, then those people are not available to do the reviews of the work if you want independent review. And one of the things which is interesting about the list of IDs you had up earlier is that if you discount the people who had heavy involvement in writing of those IDs from the list of available reviewers, the pool of available reviewers gets really small.
I totally agree. This is Peter St. Andre, by the way. Sorry. And I think that's where there's two things there, I think, John. One is that's where things border on perhaps a design team, in the sense that, let's say we want to address these fun issues that we had with, Unicode 7 and so on. We did have a small group of people who had awareness of what those issues were and looked into them, and they need, perhaps they need to work together well to come up with proposed solutions, but then finding people to actually review that work is a tougher challenge because they were all the ones involved. Yes.
This is Barry. Are we discussing these proposals now, or are we just introducing them now?
the next slide is a discussion point, I guess.
Yeah, so, yes, we're discussing. That's a
Okay.
point of fact.
So the slide says small team to start, maybe 5 people. We have had, I don't know whether we've had a formal IETN directorate before, but we've at least had a de facto one before. And we have had an IAB internationalization program before, and both of them have collapsed. What makes us think that establishing a new one will have a different result? Ted?
Ted Hardy, I just wanted to point out that the purpose of the IETN program of the IAB was not to review the IETF documents in the fashion that this is directed to.
But yet, I think its fate has a similar connotation with respect to this.
Ted Hardy, I would actually say that it's different in 2 ways, one of which is very salient to this and one of which is perhaps a bit more nebulous. One of the things that makes it a bit more nebulous is that in many ways an IETN program of the IAB must, by the IAB's nature, think about liaison relationships and how it interacts with other bodies. This work inside the IETF may or may not have to consider that, but as long as somebody's writing IETN considerations within the context of the work that the IETF has already done, they may not have to spend a great deal of time thinking about how it interacts with other bodies. The other thing is people are driven in different ways to participate in things, and people who are driven into directorate review are often simply trying to make sure that the work of the IETF completes successfully. And that may not be the same driver for people who are trying to see new frameworks or new resolution mechanisms that may be significantly different from where we are today. It's like saying the IRTF and the IETF may have different participants because they have different goals.
Wendy Seltzer, W3C, and acknowledging we face similar challenges at W3C. We have an internationalization working group that has a small number of very committed people who have a lot of work to do. So, you know, I'm happy in my liaison role to help share information from what we're doing there. I think one of the ways we've helped to work with them is through tooling and tagging, encouraging all of our groups to tag issues to send to the internationalization group for review, so that at least recognizing some of the most obvious problems and sending them over is pre-done, and then trying to make the groups responsive to the internationalization reviewers when they spot something, to reduce the burden on reviewers to make those conversations happen.
Don't go away. This is Barry. Yes, with what Wendy said, one of the issues that we have, at least in the IETF, is people not being aware that they need to tag it for internationalization review. I reviewed a document relatively recently that just thought it was sufficient to say this field will be case insensitive UTF-8. And, you know, they thought that was enough, and there's no reason to think they shouldn't think that's enough, because that's, you know, that's as far as they knew. They didn't know to tag that for more information, or they would have come to us. So there's that issue. But the W3C has recently put out a statement about increased focus on internationalization. Can you say something about that?
Why, thank you, I can. And, as John invited, yes, so W3C also has a paid staff and a staff member, Richard Ashida, whose full-time focus is internationalization, managing and doing some of the internationalization review work. And we recognized, the W3C community recognized that that was not enough, and recently launched an internationalization sponsorship effort, trying to bring in more support to fund more of the involvement of experts in internationalization work across a variety of areas, including sort of identifying gaps in the platform as well as reviewing and improving the work that's being done without a specific internationalization focus.
Hi, this is Peter again. I am actually involved with the internationalization working group at the W3C. I think it works quite well, especially the tagging of issues and things like that. John and I are on those calls quite often, and I think that work has done well. To Barry's point, why do we think we're going to get a different result this time? I think it is related a little bit to what you said, Ted, about different kinds of people involved. We haven't done, I would say, a good job of training people and recruiting people to work on these efforts at the IETF. We've had some tutorials here and there. I think that if we were potentially working on some of the less contentious issues where we do need to do sort of regular reviews, I know at W3C we have a weekly call to go over the things that are under review. If there were a regular cadence of calls that we had or meetings of some kind where we're reviewing the documents that come through and triaging things together, and that's where I think we get back to working as a team, because we've got individuals who know about things, but we haven't really had more of a team coordinated effort. I think that would help people feel more committed to that and be working on things ongoing. That's my perception anyway.
And I like that response, and I would certainly personally, this is Barry, I would personally be very happy to be part of a team that had weekly or bi-weekly conference calls and really took this as a team effort to do these reviews.
Two things I'll add. When we went through the Précis process, that was an attempt to come up with tools for people to use in their protocols to internationalize and teach them the things that they needed to know about internationalization. We are this time around separating out a triage as an independent, important thing to do, to teach people how to notice that there's a problem, not necessarily solve the problem, so they can ask for help. So I think we have the potential there to take an intermediate step that we haven't tried to take before. The other thing to point out, and having a tool does not necessarily make it useful, but the review team tools that are now available are actually much better than they were even a short period of time ago, with the ability for working group chairs to ask for reviews at different times, for those to be scheduled, for those to poke appropriate people and say, please review this document for this particular purpose. And we tend to use those tools late in the process, but they're usable earlier in the process. So I think we have at least some new things that make this potentially solvable. Any other comments on the directorate stuff?
Alyssa Cooper. So the idea is that this would be an art area directorate?
The chairs quickly look over toward art ADs who have their heads down in their phones.
Okay, Adam says that would be appropriate in his opinion. I just like to, I think it's helpful to be clear about these things because
Stucky is, yes.
Well, in theory, I think the purpose for directorates is to, and they're all sort of chartered by some portion of the ISG, right? So typically they all roll up to some set of ADs. And those ADs have some responsibilities vis-a-vis the directorate. Typically that would include like maintaining the membership, refreshing the membership, being involved in some of these discussions about recruiting, likely, establishing the review cadence or the expectations about what happens to these reviews and whatnot. And I think it's important that if people are going to go forward with this, that everybody agrees about all of those parameters, or at least is on board with what the ADs think they're going to do with this thing.
Yeah, and to that point, Alyssa, I don't think we don't really have a charter in front of us or a proposal about how it would exactly be structured and the cadence and all that kind of stuff. We're going to need to put that together as a follow-on to this.
Hi, this is Yoshiro Yonea. My comment about the directorate is how we can obtain diversity of the experts from all over the world. Because as you see, most of people here is from United States or European, and very few Asians or Arabic or such languages. But the population of such languages are very wide and high penetration in the world. So as Barry says, 5 is small, I think also, and invite much more language expert from the world is very important.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think one saving grace is that for the 80-20 rule is that 80% of these things are things that can be dealt with by anyone who has basic expertise, and it's probably even more than 80%, I would guess. But there's a chunk that actually somebody with appropriate skills would be required for, and so yeah, I think the point is well taken.
Chris Newman, another point I wanted to make about directorate is there may be people who don't want to be like full members of a directorate and commit a lot of time, but are happy to help out and, you know, if provided a way to make sure they stay up to date on what's the, you know, the latest things that should be watched for and help with reviews. So I encourage you to consider making room for that sort of participant.
Yeah, John Clinton, the Center, interacts with all 3 of the last comments. First of all, I would have agreed with 80-20 6 months ago, but my experience on a number of things that have happened in the last 6 months is such that I'm lowering that number quite a bit. The second observation is that to do well on this, beyond a certain point, and this goes to Yoshida-san's comment, you're going to have to recruit some outside expertise. One of the difficulties with recruiting outside expertise is that if we inflict upon those people, in addition to our high salaries and rich compensation packages, a good deal of IETF bureaucracy, they won't be here. So one of the issues is that the more we push this into the traditional directorate box, the less likely it will be to succeed, given that need for outside expertise and the time issue Chris mentioned and a number of other things. So be a little careful there.
Alyssa Cooper, I don't really know what bureaucracy that is. I haven't really seen that. I actually got up here to respond to Chris as well, just to note that in Gen Art, for example, we have like a diversity of review cadences. So you can have people who are part of the directorate who review once a quarter, and you can have people who review twice a month. There's probably not enough people in the world to populate this thing that that would be a useful model. But if there are, then it's not like, oh, it has to be a one size fits all.
Adam Roach, I actually got up here to ask Chris if he could clarify something about his comment. I can read what you said 2 different ways. And one is, I think, what Alyssa kind of alluded to, where it's like someone who doesn't necessarily have the time commitment, but might want to participate like either on an infrequent but periodic basis, or, you know, I want to be the person who is involved for internationalization as it pertains to, say, email. The other way that I can read it is, you know, sort of experts on tap that you can reach out to who are experts on, you know, like Indic languages that you can say, hey, I need some input on this. And I'm not sure exactly which of those 2 you were referring to. The second one I've actually already heard. The first one is kind of new, and so I'm just curious.
Chris Newman, no, it was more time constraint. You know, if you like, you know, if you asked me to participate and I had to be on a biweekly meeting, I'd say no. If you asked me to participate and I was reviewing a document every 2 weeks or something, I might very well say yes.
Ted Hardy, just up-leveling for a moment. I note that the actual proposal here is that the team should formulate a strategy for recruiting and training new members. And there are 2 different strategies that it might take. One is to take language experts and to give them the training that would be required to understand how that language expertise applied to protocol matching, sorting, algorithm issues that are particular to our world as opposed to more general. That's one set of training that might be given to people who are experts in specific language families. Or you could take people who are already familiar with the IETF's protocol suite and give them enough training to let them identify cases where they know they now need to go get language expertise from specific language families. And so, especially if the goal here is for one to do triage, I think the second is more likely than the first, and in part because I believe you'll want the people with that deep understanding of specific language families for the work that's after triage. And spending some of their effort early on may lose some of their effort in the later, more tricky bits. But I think if the proposal here is that the team formulates a strategy once formed, then this room doesn't need to formulate the strategy.
I think this, Ted, gets back to this, Peter St. Andre, gets back to something that John was saying, that there are people who know a lot more. I mean, John knows some of these folks who know a lot more about particular scripts or language families and so on than we do here. They don't necessarily want to be engaged at the level of reviewing documents, but if we have a sort of an advisory group or people that we can call on who we know, that we can say, hey, here's a sticky issue with the right to left, in the particular internet context, but to reach out to them with regard to that instead of having them necessarily involved all the time, people that we can call on as needed. I would see that model probably working better. Because those deeper issues that they might not want to be triaging and reviewing all the time.
I think what you're talking about there isn't a triage directorate, though. It's a bank of people, and maybe we can separate the two issues out.
I think triage is a function of whatever team gets put together, whether it's a directorate or something else. They need to perform triage, but then once they figure out this document needs review, this is a straightforward issue. We've got a RFC perhaps that talks about these things. We pretty much know what to do. We've documented what the usual right answer is here. That's one thing, but then, now we've got a deeper issue. We've triaged just as people that have the deeper expertise, but we still need to call in people who have even deeper expertise about certain scripts, let's say.
Harald Alström, I just want to remind people about the original meaning of triage, which was Roman legions after the battle had a process by which the doctor looked at you and divided you into one of three groups. One is will get healthy anyway. This is likely to be the ones that you can just give them a piece of advice or even say we don't care about you. The second one was needs treatment, which is something that comes after triage, and the third one was there's no hope for you. Die. So if you want to have a triage mechanism, it needs to be fast. Mm-hmm. And being fast, that means it needs to get staffed. If you triage and don't have a follow-up mechanism, then you need to have a mechanism to kill off everything you can't heal. And I don't think you have that, so better find a mechanism.
John Clenson again. Let me point out that and it goes to some extent to Ted's comment. Let me point out that we've got a much easier in some ways problem than W3C, for example, although in some ways harder. W3C has had to deal with challenges like how you punctuate Mongolian so it looks right on the page. My suspicion is the amount of IETF expertise in the punctuation of Mongolian is quite limited, and that if you put together a 5-person directorate team, you are unlikely to have any of it. They've got a whole lot of page layout issues and a whole lot of issues which are very specific to specific issues with specific languages. We have, as far as I've been able to tell, none of that. Our hardest problems are knowing that if you do something in a particular way, it is likely to screw up some language you have never heard of. And that requires enough broad expertise as distinct from language by language specific expertise to detect those kinds of issues and at least to understand them well enough to get the expertise needed to address them. We've made some mistakes that have the property that if you do so and so, then something else will be hurt. And we will probably make them again. But unless we get smart enough to either minimize that number or do damage control, we're in trouble.
This is Barry. I almost entirely agree with what John just said. The only quirk, we don't need to know the details of Amharic or something, or Mongolian, but we do need to know that in some languages this issue comes up. So like we need to know Arabic has variants and other languages have other things. And we don't need to know how to resolve that. We need to know that that issue crops up and we need to know how to deal with it. So there is some specific expertise, but nothing at the level that we're talking about there.
So given the lull in the conversation, let's quickly also look at the other proposal, which is, and this may impact how we design proposal 1 or how they will interact. So the other proposal on the table is writing up an RFC to describe internationalization issues. So this is not going to necessarily be an introductory tutorial for beginners to learn internationalization. This is aimed at developing expertise such that you could do different levels of this sort of review. So it would describe key issues and principles for reviews and document some of the oral tradition, as Dan was pointing to. No one is envisioning at this point mandating internationalization consideration sections added to every RFC. That seems to be distasteful to many. How this thing might interact with setting up a review team is, I think, an interesting question, and why I think these are non-exclusive proposals and might need to go on in parallel. Comments?
This is Barry. Are you then saying that a goal of this might be to build future members of the directorate?
I think that would help because, as I say, we do have this oral tradition. A lot of it's in John's head, but other people like Patrick Falstrom and others, and Mark Lachey and Pete and so on. We've got knowledge, but we haven't captured it anywhere. So I think it would be helpful to capture more of that on paper, so that as we do bring folks up to speed, they have an awareness of what some of the issues are that need to get addressed. And even beyond that, I think how to think about these sorts of problems.
Right. So I think this might be fun. This might be useful. John, I know John has, for certain values of fun, says John, and I know John has done at least 2 plenary presentations on internationalization, and other people have done others in various contexts, and the result is usually people walking away with a glazed look and staggering.
That is step 1.
So, but in addition to this, and like I said, this might be a fine thing to do, but I think we need a different level, something addressed to people with no I18N knowledge, that's telling you things you need to look at in your own document to tell yourself that you might need to ask us early on in the process rather than waiting until last call.
So whether 1 document or 2 or how we divide it up, at least something about the triage issue, how to find that there might be a problem, and then the expertise or tradition of how to solve the problems. Okay. Mark?
He said, "Duh, that's making me nervous these days. I don't know why." Mark Nottingham. A lot of this conversation is sounding vaguely familiar to me, in that in the HTTP world, we have the issue that everybody wants to use HTTP, yay! And they usually misuse it, and they don't understand it, and we struggle. communicating that knowledge. And so I have a cron job that sends me and Patrick a list of all the RFCs that reference HTTP specs twice a month, and we kind of shake our heads and say there's no way we can review all of those because we don't have the resources, we don't have a review team built. So that's why we started BCP 56 BIS, to document that knowledge. And part of that, and why I think that this is important, this proposal, is that if you don't have a shared truth of this is the correct thing for documents to do in this situation or IETF specifications, then you're going to have contention. You're going to have someone coming in on the review team imposing their opinion or their view of what internationalization is, which may not align with the rest of the review team and or reality. So I think if we're going to do this sort of stuff, it would be nice to write it down.
I'll give I think the W3C has done a good job of this. There was a character model for the internet document that was old and has been updated, and a lot of better things have gone into that. And so yes, having something along the lines of what you're saying, Mark, I think would be very helpful.
Dave Taylor. So I'm going to go back to one of John's comments and then give two analogies. The comment of John's I want to focus on is when you said your opinion of the percentage now is different from what it was 6 months ago. That tells me that there's a sizable percentage of information that you might need to know when doing a review or even a triage that is not necessarily static enough that as soon as you put it into an RFC, it's out of date. The two analogies that I want to give is one is the way that MIB doctors worked. The other one is the way that the RFC style guide worked. Okay. In both cases, the set of things that you're reviewing for were somewhat dynamic, and there was a subset that became relatively fixed. And so both of them kind of start off with being, a wiki page, a web page that gets kept up to date with tribal knowledge that can be revved very frequently, and that the authors and that the reviewers and even authors could go to as being the latest source of knowledge of things that reviewers were sharing information about that didn't have to wait for an RFC. Once you had a subset of that became stable enough and unchanging enough, then that portion of it moved into an RFC. And I believe that happened in both the style guide as well as in the guidelines for MIBs. Okay. And so that's the model that I think one would actually need to do here. It says the RFC isn't the starting point. You need like a wiki page or something as a starting point. And there might be a subset of it that goes to an RFC.
So may I attempt to rephrase, Dave, and confirm that I've got what you're pointing out is perhaps the title of this slide should be Proposal for Documentation, and the form of the documentation might be one, the other, or both of these kinds of mechanisms over time.
Correct. And so this gets to, I don't think the first step is let's charter a working group or a BOF or something whose task it is to define an RFC. I think that's the wrong way to frame it. I completely agree with the sharing of knowledge, right, which is, the style guide, the MIB doctors and stuff. The original sharing was not an RFC, right? It was web page, wiki style.
So a question to, I'm guessing ADs, although anybody can obviously contribute to the question. Is there a willingness to charter a working group whose output is not an internet draft that's going to go for RFC, but more developing documentation in some sort of space that will force people to concentrate on it?
I don't want to answer that question, but I want to extend that question, because whether it needs to be a working group or is just a directorate is a question.
Mm-hmm. You can answer if you want.
Alexei Manakov, we had some discussions in ISG recently about documents we really like not to be published because they have more temporal usefulness, and this is not necessarily the same example, but I personally don't see a problem with a group which is chartered to maintain certain documentation without a specific outcome, as long as we can measure success. Dan York, and I was just, to echo Dave's comments, that was my comment, it's not an RFC, it's a set of things. This is when I think about the work I was doing earlier about deployment of various protocols. It was a suite of materials. It was a thing like that. To Alexei's point, yeah, there is a value in looking at how do you do this in a way that's dynamic. that is something that you could do. The other piece is to realize that we don't have to, do all this alone. There are many other resources out there, such as the W3Cs, but other entities this is not a new topic, right? So part of the thing is, can you gather people who can look at what are the ones that are useful for people to know? What are the tutorials that have been published that are useful in some way? But it's more than one document. It's a suite of something.
And while this discussion continues, to put up the last slide, which is the conclusions that your chairs and I expect your ADs want to figure out by the time the discussion ends might be useful.
John Clenson, I want to reflect a little bit on one of the earlier comments from Mark and draw a contrast and apologize because I've managed to make it through 45 minutes of this session without saying anything snarky, but I'm about to violate that.
We'll toss appropriate chair constraints at you when that time comes.
Mark, of the people who are working actively on HTTP, how many of them do you think there are who actually understand HTTP? Significant number?
To the ability to review a document that uses HTTP?
Yeah.
A handful.
Okay. I was but that particular guideline applies to a lot of the stuff we do here in terms of having the intuitions for, quote, triage, end quote. The thing which worries me about the wiki kind of approach is you got to be sure that whatever that stuff is and however you present it, which makes much less difference, is carefully reviewed so it's actually right.
This is Andrew Sullivan. So there are two, I don't know. Maybe what I will say is I'm a little bit worried about something that is going unspoken here, because we've had a couple of suggestions. There are lots of other resources outside of our community, which is true. There are lots of people who are working on these things, which are true. And now there's this suggestion for a document here. And I think it's worth noting that one of the problems that we've had is that we are not alone in this space, but there are a number of people who seem to want to own it. And so one question that I guess I have, if we're going to tackle it with either of these techniques or both, is what we're going to do if somebody comes along and says, none of you people are qualified to do this, and none of you people should be doing it, and please sit down and shut up and go away and let us take back our proper area of expertise. And I don't want to get into the question of whether there is such a proper area of expertise or whether any of the experts in question actually have that expertise. But what do we do about that if somebody comes along and points out that actually we're not that qualified for it, admitting that, as a matter of fact, we probably aren't?
Sounds like a liaison issue, not something that worker bees would necessarily have to focus on. I don't know.
Okay, so we punt it to the IAB. that doesn't, what's the expression? Hope is not a plan.
So, Andrew, this is Adam Roach. I think if a group came to us and said, rephrasing what you said there, effectively, stop trying to get this right, we would say, okay, but it's incumbent on you now to take on the load of making sure that we do. And I think that would actually not be a terrible outcome, assuming they actually were experts. That's why I caveated it at the end.
Ted Hardy, with a hopeful response to all of this, is that yes, getting this perfect is going to be extraordinarily difficult. Getting the situation to be better than where it is today might not be. And I think the first suggestion here to make sure that we have a structured way of ensuring that this review occurs would make things better than where we are today. And that building up the resources around that structured review over time would involve both building up documentation so that things which are currently verbal knowledge and a small number of folks' experience would be broadened out into that review team, and also building up the connections between particular expertise outside the IETF and bringing it in time can take place over time. We don't have to run up against this problem and say, I hit my head on the bricks and now I'm going to sit down. We can say, okay, here's some grout. I can start pulling it at this particular brick, get it a little bit better, and move on from there. So I think that there are some action items we can take from this that really do result in things getting better without necessarily us fooling ourselves that they're going to resolve the entire problem. I mean, I had a conversation at one of the ICANN meetings with a language expert in Ethiopian languages, which cross multiple different language families using a single script, a different problem than the one John was just alluding to. And it just reminds you that it's always a little bit worse than you thought in the internationalization world. Well, so I don't think trying to come up in this room or in general with a grand unifying theory of internationalization is likely to result in anything but a quick headache. So I think we ought to be looking at what makes tomorrow better.
Alyssa Cooper, here. I just wanted to flag sort of a little bit of a theme that I've heard on the list discussions and today, for people to keep it in mind as if this work goes forward as it gets described. And that has to do with the notion of sort of exclusivity in terms of who can do this work and just how incredibly challenging and difficult it is to get right all of things which are all true. But if the notion is to eventually try to involve more people in this work and inspire people to look at this area and say, hey, there's some hard problems. Maybe those would be fun to work on. Maybe I would find them compelling as somebody who is new to networking or new to languages or both. I think we need to be very careful about how we frame this so that there can eventually be a pipeline of people who could be in a position to contribute to this, even if they can't do so today.
Well, and I think this is Peter St. Andre. I think that gets back to what Ted is talking about, which is incremental improvement. Our base is very low right now. We are very ad hoc. We don't bring people along into learning about these things. I think if we had more structure, a little bit more structure around it, and we could try to lift up the level of knowledge about some of the folks that participate, that would be great. It is a very difficult area. I've been trying to learn about this for the last 10 years or so, and I feel like I don't know very much. So it's because there is a lot of complexity, which John is going to now tell us about.
No, actually, I was going to say something quite contradictory. I don't believe that this work is fundamentally harder than a deep understanding of, for example, internet routing and what all the issues are there. It's just different. And our difficulty is that we have not a lot, but a reasonable number of people here who have that level of understanding of internet routing. And we have a much smaller number of people here who have that level of understanding of this problem, in part because it isn't taught in computer science network engineering school. The other observation is that I am all in favor of making incremental improvements. But what stimulated Patrick's and my request for this BOF was the fact that ultimately a binary decision has to be made by the area directors in the ISG. And that binary decision is about whether or not we are ready and competent to review any particular document. And that decision may have some fuzzy edges, but it's ultimately not a making things a little bit better kind of decision. It's a when are things good enough decision.
So we are right at time, and I think we can just creep over a minute or two to at least for us to express what we're getting a sense of from the room. I've first heard that people seem to think that a director at a group of some sort is an appropriate thing to undertake. It's going to have a range of tasks, maybe with a range of participant types, which include triage, include some more expert review, include the ability to maybe give a document or a particular issue to a super expert to help with a particular gnarly issue. I'm also hearing that an internationalization RFC is not going to be the target as much as some sort of internationalization documentation, which might involve an RFC, might involve some more dynamic text, and that getting a group together to work on that would be a good thing. Anything else you've heard or anything from the floor that we have missed? Anything else that the ADs need to hear? I mean, I think, well, and I mean, we can do a hand-raising exercise to see what constituencies there are, but do you care? I mean, I think we need to at least develop the discussion so that people get a better idea of what they might be volunteering for. But I think in the long term, we're going to want people who are interested to learn enough to triage, people who are interested to learn enough to, well, as I did when I was young and stupid, decide to implement an international text editor. And so I've learned to hunt and peck at least 4 scripts, John, but, you know, you see where that's gotten me. You know, and then people who are willing to contribute expertise, which I don't think is generally in this room. So
third category, I agree. I actually was going to ask you to
do those.
Do the quick, you know, at a high level, who has the time and inclination to work on this problem?
Okay, so high level, and I'll split it in 2. High level, who has time and inclination to learn enough to triage, and part 2, time and inclination to be more expert-like folks. So the first, who is inclined to try and learn to triage and be part of such a team? Okay, so I'm seeing 5 hands in 8. Yeah, okay. So a smallish group. Are there folks in the room who feel like they have the time and inclination to learn more deep expertise and contribute to such reviews? And yes, about the same number and different people, I'll note. Yeah. So we're talking in the dozen-ish category, and for what that's worth to forming such a group.
Do you want to ask the question of who's setting the purchase order?
Yeah, where the purchase order goes and what the hourly rate is always interesting. Stuart.
Stuart Cheshire, I'm going to offer a third option, which is I've noticed that we've got more students attending with things like ANRW running. I'm prepared to be an ambassador recruiting some of the younger students who are asking, how can I contribute to the IETF? And I don't have the time to take this on myself, but I think all of us in this room can spread the word to other people.
Yes, I like that idea very much.
I do too.
So right. So yes, and so part of next steps, which Harold just mentioned, is what form are we going to use to continue this discussion? And we have a mailing list. Do we need to do something in addition to that? And what are our timeframes for next steps? He turns to the ADs who might be implicated.
I think the mailing list is probably.
Yeah, probably good.
Got it?
I think the mailing list is probably just fine for this. Next steps, I think I want to confer with my co-ADs to sort of figure out what a reasonable way forward here is. I don't think it can take a lot of time because it was, I think the messages we heard here were relatively clear, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page first.
We are 5 minutes over. Anyone want to keep us here or go get your cookies? Go get your cookies. Thank you all.
Thank you. Did anyone not sign the blue sheets?
Yes, blue sheets, please make their way up to the front.
They're right in front of you.
Well, blue sheets, please make your way to people who have not signed.
Why not?
Readily available. Yes. No one.
Oh, here you go.
Oh, there we go. I was watching.
Yeah. Yes.
Emoji has been the trigger.
I think it is.
Tell me 16 bucks.
Yeah, it's on.
It's